What if I told you, the moment you start pulling away, the avoidant doesn't panic like you expect, they study you instead. They don't chase loudly, they test quietly. They disappear, they act cold, they trigger your emotions on purpose, just to see one thing. Do you still care, or have they really lost control over you? And in that silence, most people break without even realizing they're being tested. When we talk about avoidant psychology, one of the most misunderstood behaviors is emotional withdrawal. On the surface, it can look like indifference, rejection, or even a lack of love. But in reality, it is rarely about not caring. It is about how certain individuals have learned to protect themselves when emotions start to feel too intense, too uncertain, or too overwhelming. For someone with avoidant tendencies, emotional closeness can feel like losing control rather than gaining connection, and that inner discomfort shapes the way they respond in relationships. When they begin to sense emotional tension or the possibility of losing someone, their first instinct is not to move closer, but to step back. This stepping back is not always a conscious decision. It is often an automatic defense mechanism built over time through experiences where vulnerability may have felt unsafe, rejected, or emotionally draining. Instead of expressing fear, insecurity, or sadness openly, they suppress it. To an outsider, this suppression can look like coldness. They may stop initiating conversations, reduce emotional expression, or act unusually detached. However, internally, there is often a quiet struggle between wanting connection and fearing emotional exposure. This is why emotional withdrawal should not be mistaken for emotional absence. In many cases, avoidant individuals feel deeply, but they struggle to process and express those feelings in real time. When emotions intensify, they may feel psychologically crowded, as if the relationship is demanding more closeness than they can comfortably handle. So they create distance not to punish the other person, but to regulate their own internal state. Distance becomes their way of breathing again, of regaining emotional stability. Another important layer is control. Avoidant psychology is often tied to a strong need for autonomy. Emotional closeness can sometimes feel like dependency, and dependency can feel threatening. So when they start to feel like they are losing emotional control, they withdraw to restore their sense of independence. This is why they may seem fine one moment and distant the next. It is not always about the partner's actions. It is about their internal threshold being crossed. However, this behavior creates confusion in relationships. The partner often interprets withdrawal as loss of interest or emotional fading, which leads to anxiety, overthinking, and sometimes chasing behavior. Ironically, this reaction can intensify the avoidant's need to pull back even more, creating a cycle of distance and pursuit. But at the core, the avoidant is not necessarily trying to end the relationship. They are trying to manage emotional intensity in the only way they know, through space. Understanding this pattern changes everything. Instead of seeing withdrawal as a final answer, it can be seen as a signal of emotional overload. It reveals where their comfort zone ends and where their coping mechanisms begin. This does not mean the behavior is easy to deal with or should be accepted without boundaries. It simply means that the behavior is rooted in protection, not pure disinterest. In reality, emotional withdrawal is a paradox. The same person who pulls away to feel safe may also be the one who feels the absence deeply once distance grows. But because they are not comfortable expressing that vulnerability, they remain silent, creating a surface-level impression of detachment. Understanding this contradiction is the first step in seeing avoidant behavior for what it truly is, not a lack of feeling, but a struggle to handle feeling too much at once. One of the most intriguing aspects of avoidant psychology is the way distance becomes a tool of communication. Instead of directly asking for reassurance, clarity, or emotional connection, avoidant individuals often rely on indirect signals. This is where testing behavior begins, not in a dramatic or obvious way, but in subtle shifts of attention, availability, and emotional presence. To the outside world, it may look like silence or inconsistency, but internally, it is often a quiet form of observation. When emotional tension rises, avoidants rarely say what they feel outright. Expressing need or vulnerability can feel exposing, so instead, they create space and watch what happens. This space is not empty for them, it is active. In that distance, they are studying patterns, Do you chase them immediately? Do you become anxious? Do you stay calm? Do you withdraw as well? Every reaction becomes information that helps them understand the emotional safety of the relationship. This is why their tests are not always intentional games, but rather instinctive experiments rooted in emotional self-protection. For example, they may suddenly reduce texting frequency, delay responses, or become less emotionally expressive. On the surface, this looks like disinterest, but underneath, it is often a way of checking whether the bond is stable, even without constant reassurance. They are asking a silent question. If I step back, will this connection collapse, or will it still exist without pressure? The challenge is that this style of testing creates confusion for the other person. Most individuals interpret distance as rejection, not evaluation, so instead of understanding the psychological layer, they respond emotionally by overthinking, chasing, or trying harder to reconnect. Ironically, this response gives the avoidant exactly the data they are unconsciously looking for. It confirms that closeness creates emotional intensity, and that distance is the only way they can regulate the relationship. At the core of this behavior is fear, not manipulation. Avoidants are often highly sensitive to emotional pressure, even if they do not express it. Too much intensity can feel like loss of autonomy, and loss of autonomy can feel unsafe. So instead of engaging directly with emotional discomfort, they step back to observe it from a safer distance. In that space, they feel more in control of their own emotions and the dynamic itself. What makes this pattern even more complex is that avoidants are not always aware they are testing. It is not usually a conscious strategy with a clear intention. It is more like an emotional reflex developed over time. If past relationships or early life experiences taught them that closeness can lead to overwhelm, rejection, or emotional pressure, then stepping back becomes their default response when uncertainty appears. During this distance, they are not emotionally inactive. They are often analyzing your consistency, emotional regulation, and independence. They want to know whether you can exist without constant validation, because in their internal logic, emotional safety is linked to self-sufficiency. If they sense that you remain grounded, patient, and stable, it can slowly reduce their internal anxiety. If they sense panic or emotional escalation, it can reinforce their belief that closeness is risky. However, this creates a paradox. The very thing they seek to secure emotional connection is tested in a way that often destabilizes it. Because instead of direct communication, there is silence. Instead of reassurance, there is uncertainty. And instead of clarity, there is interpretation. This gap between intention and perception is where most misunderstandings in avoidant relationships are born. Ultimately, avoidant distance testing is less about control over the other person and more about control over emotional risk. It is their way of answering an unspoken question: can this connection survive without overwhelming me? The tragedy is that while they are trying to find safety, their method often creates the very insecurity they are trying to avoid. Silence in avoidant psychology is rarely empty. To someone experiencing it from the outside, it can feel like distance, rejection, or emotional shutdown. But internally, silence is often highly active. It becomes a psychological mirror, reflecting back the emotional patterns, reactions, and stability of the other person. Instead of engaging directly with emotional intensity, avoidant individuals often step into silence as a way of observing what unfolds when their presence is removed from the dynamic. When communication stops or becomes minimal, the relationship does not stop existing in the mind of an avoidant person. In fact, that is often when their internal processing becomes more pronounced. They begin to analyze the emotional environment from a safer distance. Without the pressure of immediate response, they can observe without feeling overwhelmed. This is why silence is not always avoidance of the relationship itself, but avoidance of emotional overload while still staying mentally connected to the situation. In this quiet space, they often become highly attentive to patterns rather than words. They are not just asking what is being said, but more importantly, what happens when I don't respond? Your behavior during their silence becomes a form of emotional data. Do you panic and chase? Do you stay composed and give space? Do you detach completely? Each reaction creates a different interpretation in their mind about emotional safety, attachment intensity, and relational balance. This is where the idea of silence as a mirror becomes important. It does not just reflect the avoidance emotional state, it reflects the other person's attachment response as well. If the partner becomes highly anxious, repeatedly reaches out, or tries to force reconnection, it can amplify the avoidance perception that emotional closeness leads to pressure. If the partner remains grounded and stable, it may challenge their assumption that distance automatically leads to loss of connection. However, this mirroring effect is not always conscious. Avoidant individuals are not usually sitting and intentionally testing every response in a calculated way. Instead, they are often trying to regulate their own emotional system. Silence becomes a space where they can reduce emotional intensity and regain internal balance. At the same time, because they still care or remain emotionally invested on some level, they cannot fully disengage, so they observe indirectly through distance. The most important thing to understand is that silence often activates imagination more than reality. In the absence of communication, both sides begin to interpret meaning. The avoidant may interpret pursuit as emotional pressure, while the other person interprets silence as rejection. This creates a loop of misunderstanding where neither side feels fully seen. The silence becomes a projection screen where fears, insecurities, and assumptions are amplified. For avoidance, silence can also serve as emotional self-protection. When feelings become too intense or confusing, stepping back allows them to process without immediate emotional demand. They may not have the language to express what they feel, so instead of speaking, they withdraw. In that withdrawal, they are trying to regain control over internal chaos. The silence is less about the other person and more about stabilizing themselves. At the same time, silence gives them space to evaluate emotional consistency. They may ask themselves internally whether the connection still feels safe when it is not being actively maintained. This is not always a logical process, it is often felt rather than thought. They are sensing whether attachment feels secure even in the absence of constant interaction. But the paradox is that silence, while meant to create clarity, often creates distortion instead, because without communication, assumptions fill the gap. What was meant to regulate emotion can instead increase confusion on both sides. The avoidant may misread emotional pursuit as pressure, and the partner may misread distance as abandonment. In the end, silence in avoidant psychology is not passive. It is a dynamic psychological space where observation, emotional regulation, and interpretation all happen at once. It becomes a mirror not because it reflects truth perfectly, but because it reflects emotional reactions back to both people involved, often magnifying whatever fear or need already exists within them. Control in avoidant psychology is not about dominating others or manipulating situations in a calculated way. At its core, it is about emotional safety. For many avoidant individuals, control becomes the emotional structure that keeps relationships from feeling overwhelming or unpredictable. When emotions start to rise too quickly, or when intimacy begins to deepen beyond their comfort level, they may find it difficult to maintain a healthy relationship. The need to regain control is often what drives their behavior. It is less about power over someone else and more about preventing themselves from feeling emotionally flooded. To understand this, it is important to recognize how closeness is processed internally. For someone with avoidant tendencies, emotional intimacy can sometimes feel like a loss of personal space or autonomy. While many people associate closeness with comfort and security, avoidant individuals may experience it as pressure or emotional demand. When they feel that their independence is being threatened, even unintentionally, their system responds by trying to re-establish balance. That balance often comes through emotional distance, reduced communication, or controlled engagement. This is where control becomes a form of regulation. By limiting emotional exposure, they reduce the intensity of what they feel. If conversation becomes too emotionally charged, they may withdraw. If a relationship starts to feel too consuming, they may slow things down. If expectations feel too heavy, they may become less available. These actions are not always conscious decisions, often they are automatic responses, designed to lower internal emotional tension. From the outside, this can be misunderstood as inconsistency or lack of interest. One moment they may appear engaged and connected, and the next they may seem distant or detached. But internally, they are trying to maintain a level of emotional equilibrium that feels manageable. Control gives them the ability to regulate how much emotional input they are receiving at any given time. Without it, they may feel emotionally overwhelmed or even trapped. Another important aspect of control in avoidant psychology is predictability. When emotions are unpredictable or intense, avoidant individuals often feel unsafe, so they attempt to create patterns that feel more stable, even if those patterns involve distance. For example, they may prefer relationships where emotional expectations are lower, or where communication is less constant. This allows them to engage without feeling consumed by emotional demands. However, this need for control can create a cycle of misunderstanding in relationships. The more they pull back to feel safe, the more the other person may feel insecure or rejected. That insecurity often leads to more emotional pursuit, questions, or attempts to reconnect. Ironically, this increased emotional intensity reinforces the avoidance belief that closeness requires control to manage, so they withdraw further, not because they want to hurt the relationship, but because they are trying to stabilize their internal emotional state. It is also important to understand that control in this context is not always rigid or deliberate. It can be subtle and situational. Sometimes it appears as emotional pauses in conversation. Sometimes it shows emotion up as delayed responses. Sometimes it is expressed through shifting levels of engagement. These are all ways of regulating how much emotional closeness they are exposed to at once. At a deeper level, control is tied to trust specifically. Trust in emotional safety. Many avoidant individuals have learned, through experience, that too much emotional openness can lead to discomfort, disappointment, or feeling emotionally overwhelmed. So instead of fully surrendering to emotional flow, they keep one foot outside the intensity. That one foot out is what creates the impression of distance or guardedness. Yet, paradoxically, this same need for control can prevent the very connection they may also desire. Because while control reduces emotional risk, it also limits emotional depth. Relationships require some degree of emotional vulnerability, and when that vulnerability is constantly regulated, intimacy can feel incomplete or unstable. In essence, control in avoidant psychology is a survival mechanism disguised as emotional distance. It is the mind's way of saying, I need space to feel safe. But in relationships, that space can sometimes be misunderstood as rejection, creating a cycle where both people are trying to feel secure, but in opposite directions. In avoidant psychology, one of the most emotionally charged dynamics in relationships is how reactions shape perception. It is not just what you feel or what you say that matters, but how you respond in moments of distance, silence, or uncertainty. For someone with avoidant tendencies, your reaction becomes a form of emotional information. It tells them whether closeness feels safe, whether emotional intensity is manageable, and whether the connection can exist without creating pressure. This is why the phrase your reaction either calms or confirms their fear is so important in understanding this pattern. When an avoidant individual pulls back, they are often already in a heightened internal state. That state is not always visible, but internally there may be emotional discomfort, confusion, or a need for space to regulate themselves. At that moment, they are highly sensitive to how the other person responds. If the response is calm, steady, and non-reactive, it can create a sense of emotional safety. It signals that the connection does not immediately collapse under distance or uncertainty. This can soften their internal defensiveness and allow them to re-engage at their own pace. However, when the reaction is intense, such as panic, repeated messaging, emotional confrontation, or desperation, it can reinforce their internal belief that closeness leads to emotional overwhelm. For avoidant individuals, high emotional intensity is often associated with pressure rather than comfort. So when they see strong emotional pursuit, it may not feel like love in a reassuring form. Instead, it may feel like emotional demand. This does not mean the other person is doing something wrong emotionally, but it highlights a mismatch in emotional processing styles. This is where the idea of confirmation of fear comes in. Avoidant individuals often carry an underlying fear that relationships require sacrificing personal space or emotional autonomy. When their withdrawal is met with anxiety or escalation, it can unintentionally confirm that belief. Their internal narrative becomes strengthened. If I get too close, things become emotionally overwhelming. As a result, They may withdraw further not out of rejection, but out of self-protection. On the other hand, when the response is grounded and self-regulated, it can disrupt that narrative. If the other person maintains emotional balance, continues living their life, and does not escalate the situation, then the situation will be resolved. It introduces a different possibility into the avoidant's internal world. It suggests that emotional connection does not necessarily equal emotional pressure. This can gradually reduce their defensive response and allow for more openness over time. But this dynamic is delicate and often misunderstood. Staying calm does not mean suppressing emotions or pretending not to care. It means regulating emotional expression so that it does not turn into panic-driven behavior. Avoidants are often highly attuned to emotional energy. Even when they do not express their own emotions openly, they can sense urgency, anxiety, and pressure in communication patterns, even in subtle forms. So the tone of reaction matters as much as the action itself. Another important layer is timing. Immediate emotional escalation tends to intensify avoidant withdrawal, while measured responses can create space for reflection. In that space, avoidant individuals are more likely to reprocess the situation internally rather than react defensively. This is because their system is not being overwhelmed in real time, allowing them to regain a sense of emotional control. However, this does not mean the responsibility lies entirely on one side. Relationships are not psychological experiments where one person must always remain regulated, while the other is distant. Instead, this dynamic highlights the importance of emotional compatibility and communication styles. When both individuals understand each other's patterns, reactions become less triggering and more meaningful. At the deepest level, reactions in avoidant dynamics are about emotional safety signals. Every response communicates something: safety, pressure, distance, or stability. Avoidant individuals interpret these signals not just logically, but emotionally, and those interpretations shape whether they move closer or step further away. In the end, your reaction does not define your worth, or your love. It simply becomes part of the emotional environment they are trying to interpret. And in avoidant psychology, that environment plays a major role in whether fear is reinforced or gradually softened. The real shift in avoidant psychology happens when emotional reactivity is replaced with emotional stability, not coldness, not emotional shutdown, not playing games, but a grounded presence that does not collapse under uncertainty. This is what is meant by "you don't break." In avoidant dynamics, emotional intensity often creates instability in the relationship because one side moves away while the other side moves closer in anxiety. But when that pattern is interrupted, when you remain steady, even in the presence of distance, it changes the entire emotional equation. For avoidant individuals, emotional intensity can feel like pressure, even when it comes from love. So when someone reacts with panic, overthinking, repeated messages, or emotional urgency, it often reinforces their internal need to create space. But when the same situation is met with calmness, patience, and self-control, something different happens internally. The avoidant nervous system begins to register that connection does not automatically equal emotional overwhelm. That realization does not always happen instantly, but over time, it creates a new emotional reference point. Staying centered does not mean ignoring your emotions. It means not allowing your emotions to control your behavior in moments of uncertainty. There is a difference between feeling deeply and reacting impulsively. Avoidant psychology often thrives in environments of emotional unpredictability. So when they encounter someone who remains emotionally consistent, it creates a contrast they are not used to. That consistency can slowly reduce their defensive need to withdraw. The most important part of this shift is that it removes emotional chasing from the dynamic. Chasing, whether emotional, verbal, or behavioral, often increases distance in avoidant relationships because it increases perceived pressure. When that chasing stops, the dynamic changes. The absence of pursuit is not punishment, it is emotional regulation. It signals that connection is not dependent on urgency or anxiety-driven behavior. In that space, something subtle but powerful happens. The avoidant individual is no longer being emotionally pushed or pulled. They are left with the experience of the connection without pressure. This allows them to reflect instead of react. Reflection is where avoidant individuals often begin to process their emotions more clearly, because they are not being overwhelmed by external intensity. However, It is important to understand that not breaking does not mean becoming indifferent. It means maintaining emotional integrity. You still care, but you do not abandon yourself in the process. This is where many people struggle, because avoidant dynamics can trigger insecurity in a way that pushes them into over-efforting or emotional over-explaining. But real change in the dynamic happens when self-respect becomes the anchor. When you remain steady, you also stop reinforcing the avoidant fear that relationships are emotionally consuming. Instead, you introduce a different emotional experience, one where connection exists without pressure, and space does not automatically mean loss. That difference can slowly soften their internal defenses, because it challenges the core belief that emotional closeness is unsafe or overwhelming. But the most powerful part of this shift is internal, not external. It is not about changing the avoidant person's behavior directly. It is about changing your own emotional center so that their distance does not destabilize you. When you reach that state, you are no longer reacting from fear. You are responding from awareness, and that changes the entire emotional tone of the interaction. In avoidant psychology, consistency becomes more influential than intensity. Intensity burns fast and often triggers withdrawal. Consistency, however, builds psychological safety over time. It shows that emotional presence is not dependent on constant reassurance or immediate response. That stability becomes the foundation for healthier interaction patterns. Ultimately, the real shift happens when you stop trying to force closeness and instead embody stability. Because in avoidant dynamics, the moment you stop breaking under emotional uncertainty is often the moment the entire pattern begins to lose its power over you.